Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today is the reverse Sensemaker series with Jordan Hall. And the idea here was for Jordan to be a little bit selfish and source the collective intelligence of the Stoa in regards to the commons and commoning. So how the series went so far, the first session, Jordan shared his thoughts on commons and commoning. Session 2, Jordan wasn't here, but Bonita, Evan McMullen, Forrest Landry engaged in Dialogos on the commoning. And today we will have Jordan in Dialogos with John Vervaeke, Gregg, Henriques, and Paul Vanderklay agreed to come. I don't see him in the room right now. If Paul, you're here, you can wave. If not, perhaps Evan, you can replace Paul if he doesn't show up after Jordan's comments. So how today's going to work, 90 minutes in total. The first 60 minutes will be Dialogos with John, Jordan, Gregg, and Paul or Evan. And then the second part will be 30 minutes Q&A, 30 to 20 minutes Q&A. And dialogue will start after I tag in Jordan, and he'll make his opening thoughts, and then that will cue John, Gregg, and Paul or Evan to jump in. But first, if everyone except Jordan, Gregg, and John, and Evan, I guess, to turn off their camera, because the recording will only pick up their faces, so that will look better when we post it on YouTube. So I'll give everyone a moment just to turn off their camera. And if John's in this room, if John, you can turn on your camera. I'll manually put people. Stop video. Okay, there we go. So I will take you in now, Jordan. It looks like Evan will be the replacement for Paul.
Cool. Yeah, I'm actually pretty sure that's how it worked out with the apostles. Apparently, originally it was actually going to be Matthew, but he was late, and so Jesus actually had Peter be the stone upon which he would build his church. So, welcome, Evan. And also, I'd like to apologize for not making last week. I had forgotten that there was a woven into the fabric of the nature of the universe itself is that Forrest and I can't actually be in the same place at the same time. So when he chose to show up, it literally bumped me from the causal field, and I ended up very disoriented for the entire period that was happening. So what I'd like to do here is maybe the feeling I have is it's a bit like pulling back a bowstring. So the intent is very much less about the creation of a narrative, and more about the invocation and the instantiation here of some aspect of which has been taking place in what I'll call the transmedia event, or for those who are a bit more Gen X, the hyper conversation, and to bring it here so that we can then continue that as an aspect of that hyper conversation. What I mean by that is that there's been now 2 conversations in the context of the Stoa, but there's actually been many other conversations, some of which have been, for example, Gregg and I have had 2, John and I have had a call. There's been conversations offline, and my sense is that the best way of contemplating that is in the context of a hyper conversation, which, by the way, flag is a topic that's actually worthy of its own discussion of how we get artful and masterful at hyper conversation. But to kind of bring that energy back here and then let it go where it needs to go. So some of the things that have been brought into this particular space, and by the way, Peter, great choice of an opening track, is a feeling into the nature of the political in the context of some of the things that have more broadly been considered in the Stoa with this group. Not a particularly political group most of the time. In the context of the domain of the political, a proposition that I put in there, which was that there are at least three fundamental modes of governance: the market, the state, and then now the commons. Right? And proposing that the commons is a not only is it a fundamental mode of governance, or commoning is a fundamental mode of governance, but then in fact it is more fundamental than either the market or the state. And a great deal of the error that we have had over the past thousands and thousands of years is the unconsciousness of that, and the evaporation of the commons and the commoning into some variation of market and state. So then also a notion that for us to get to where we want to go, to steal the culture, involves, at least in a significant degree, a remembering of the commons and a recovery of commoning, or a reinventio of commoning. And then from that basis to then emerge the other aspects of the larger story as it begins to embody itself into the world. Many things showed up in the conversation with Evan and Benita and Forrest, but one that I particularly wanted to hit the tone on was the relationship between the sacred and the commons. In fact, possibly even the identity between the two, but certainly the degree to which one doesn't really grasp the nature of the commons unless one grasps its deeply intimate relationship with the notion of the sacred, and vice versa. And in that consideration, the very interesting sort of two sides of the coin, where on the one hand, we can contemplate the commons as that which cannot be owned in principle, but also the commons is that which is only truly owned. And here Forrest sort of provided some pointers to things like the intrinsic choicefulness of being human, or the notion of meaning itself, to pursue a meaningful life as something which is strictly inalienable, strictly truly owned. And then, the last piece that I wanted to put out there is, I'm not sure if this is relevant, but it feels like it might be kind of a helpful scaffolding, which is not the last time, but at least a very powerful, more recent time, where from my point of view, something along the lines of what we're talking about happened. And this was the emergence or the birth of the Republican movement, democracy, as it's sometimes called, into the world at the American Revolution and thereafter globally. It's sometimes difficult for contemporary people to recall that prior to 1776, effectively nobody on the planet had even the notion that it made any sense at all for the people to have a voice in the structures of their governance. Right? There's a completely different mode of how governance operated. It was distinctly not Republican or Democratic. And then in the eruption of the American Revolution and in the waves of republicanism that followed, some more gentle than others, in the space of about 150 years, that had been completely replaced, such that it became commonplace that everywhere in the world, more or less, was governed, at least provisionally, at least formally, by the will of the people. And it became sort of obvious that's how it should be. Whether or not it continues to be the case, I think, is part of our exploration. And I noticed that particular moment because if I really zoom in on the origin story, we kind of get lost in the more famous architectures. But I look at say, for example, the Declaration of Independence. The languaging of it speaks to me of the primacy of the commons. Right? The notion of self-evident truths and inalienable rights speak to things that are truly owned. And the notion of and therefore the authority, the fundamental authority of the people, which is to say the commons, to throw off a particular architecture of governance, a particular structure of market and state in their relationship, and replace it with something that is more in alignment with their values and their needs. And then I can point to the specific structures of, for example, the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment of the separation of church and state. And here I would say that church here deeply represents the notion of the commons, certainly in the mind of that era. And then the Second Amendment, which was the proposition that the body of the commons must maintain its capacity to, if necessary by force, to throw off the structures of the state and the market. All of which for me is simply evidence of the mindset, and not even just the mindset, but the underlying base, that there was a development of a form of commoning that gave rise to a capacity to emerge a commons that had the ability to present itself out into the world and to break through senescent structure, and then to give birth or to rebirth a new form of structure to support the culture. So those are my opening remarks. I'm interested to see where the conversation goes from there.
Well, maybe I'll start. It's wonderful to be here again. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me, and Jordan for inviting me into your tenure as the monthly sage, which is great. It's well deserved. And of course, it's great to see my friend Gregg here as well. Evan, I think we've met, but I'm not sure. So I hope to get to know you better. The thing I want to pick up on, because when I was watching, I've watched quite a video, I watch a lot of Jordan's videos. I've watched the video sequence around the idea of the Jubilee, and then I've watched the one on the comparison of norms, laws, and codes. And I want to respond mostly to that. Maybe we can come back because I see the origin of the commons predating the American Constitution. And I think, I mean, there's always been a commons. That's Jordan's point. What I mean is something like the cultural recognition of the commons. I see it in the Protestant Reformation as where it comes with Luther's notion of the priesthood of all believers, and that the interior of the church should be run as democratically as possible. And the idea was that the priesthood of all believers was specifically towards Jordan's idea that that which was in common was sacred, and we were all priests to each other, which was an attempt to get rid of the hierarchical notion of the sacred and replace it with something that was more, I don't know, democratically implemented or something like that. That sounds too mechanical. So the question I want to focus in on, because I think that's where I can, so just to go back to the point I was making, which is that I want to zero in on that idea because I think there's been a long-standing relationship between the sacred and that which is, but I want to invert it. We don't hold it in common. It holds us in common, and that's what I want to start to probe. Because when I was thinking about what Jordan was talking about, I was thinking of Wittgenstein, and I was thinking about something analogous. And I was thinking about how we have our speech acts, our everyday discourse, and these are bound in what he calls language games, which give us more local normativity. I'm trying to deepen the layers of the normative dimension. And then the language game is itself dependent on what he calls forms of life, which are these very, very deep things. And my attempt to get at what forms of life are things like cultural cognitive grammar. And I think that, by the way, is an appropriate transposition to make of Jordan's work, because he offered as his first example of the commons language and how we use language. And one of the things that is very interesting to me, and when I'm getting into with Chris and with Jordan and with Guy and with Gregg, right, is this whole idea of what is the normativity at work in when we're trying, and this is what, you know, this has been the thrust of Wittgenstein and Heidegger and even postmodernism. They keep trying to get at what is this normativity? How is it layered? What does it bottom out in? Is it ultimately groundless? Is it grounded in something? And so I think for me, I understand why that there was a separation of church and state. And I think it was important because it was trying to keep, as Jordan said, the commons free from the state. But one of the things it did is I think it incorrectly created a correspondence thinking in people's mind that the church and the state are equally the same kind of entity. And then later on, of course, there's the market. And I used to think that way too, and they all play off against each other. But now I'm thinking, and of course, the church can do that. Let's not deny that. The church can become an institution. So I don't want to talk about that per se, but I want to talk about this notion, and I want to open it up because I don't think we hold the commons if it's the sacred. I think the sacred holds us. And what does that take from us in our practice to recognize, because let's say that recognizing it as the church, and again, I'm not denying that has all kinds of historical value. All I want to point my finger on right now is when we reified it into another institution, I think we turned it into another place or thing or entity which we can manipulate or enter into contracts with, etc. And I want to open up for discussion this idea of the inversion and say, no, we're actually held in the sacred. And then what do we have to do in discourse? And by discourse, I mean something that is dialogical in recognition that the dialogue is ultimately held in the sacred rather than the other way around. And what does that mean for us? How are we supposed to, create the culture that will allow for a restructuring at the cultural cognitive grammar level of how we consider governance? Because I think we have to resituate things that way if we're going to make progress on that. So that's my first piece to offer.
Great. I could pick up on that. To sync up with that, I'll offer some thoughts in terms of, I listened to Jordan's first structure, and he and I had a conversation back on Wednesday, his first presentation of this. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to sync up on the concept of norms into the concept of laws, and then into code, and then come back to commons and commony. So listening to the concept of norms, Jordan talked about that really goes down to the layer of mammal. It is self in relationship to other in a perspectival participatory dance. The way I would track that would be in what I call the influence matrix, which basically is a map of the architecture of how we're engaged in recursive relational relevance realization, to line up with John. And what we're doing in recursive relevance realization is we are seeing our value and our influence relative to the value and influence of the person or group that we are in tune with. And the argument is, in terms of the core architecture of our primate structure, is that we're seeking what I call relational value and social influence. That is, we're tracking, hey, am I known and valued by important others? And do I value them? And what is that relation? And how do we navigate it around power? Who has control? Who has hierarchy? Love, connection versus hostility, and autonomy. And the fundamental argument is that what we're guided by, and I see this clinically all the time, at an intuitive level, is being known and valued by important others. And I have long thought that the goal of a system, is to maximize. If you were to design a social commons, it would be maximizing the shared sense of being known and valued across the group. So that provides some framing, both about what I would say would organize our core needs as primates. By the way, starting, you mentioned your 2-year-old, with attachment, a secure base, safe haven, because I have parents and significant others that care about me and know and value me. We then talked about the emergence of laws, and you connected that to the emergence of agriculture and then in writing. So then laws are going to be the way, when we create what happened with agriculture and then into civilization, is that we broke away from nature and we started creating a technology bubble around us. And we expanded the Dunbar number of contact, meaning we had to go from, say, up to 150 people of oral indigenous relations to managing thousands upon thousands, and we needed to regulate that. So we needed laws that would give us algorithms that would say, hey, what's okay, and regulate the structure of control and money and power. So then we created laws to create the institutional relation between our technology that we were building and how we would regulate our social relations. And then finally, code, which is sort of the deep control, the real mechanisms of culture and of nature initially, that sort of drive the underlying energy transformation. which now with technology, another thing about technology, then we gain technological mastery over code. So what I'm hearing is if we can take these three domains, our primate heart, the formalized structures of justification to regulate law, and the emerging technologies that we have for controlling energy flow, ultimately, what we would want to do is to create a common way of being that would maximize our felt sense of relational value at some level and our cultivation toward the good. And so what Jordan and I were talking about was, hey, commons foundationally has to connect to the sacred, to the grounding of value, and the awareness of what our potentials are and see how to align them. And I think we're all sensing that we need to steal the culture and rethink the current arrangement. And I think that outline that Jordan has articulated is fascinating and ripe with potential. Evan, you need to.
Sorry, had a bit of trouble unmuting there with the controls on this meeting. So yeah, I wanted to kind of tie together some of the two things you guys just mentioned. John, you were talking about the sacred holding the state and not the other way around. And then Gregg, you brought in the idea of relational relevance realization. And I think these two can be synthesized in a really fruitful and interesting way for this conversation. And so what I mean by that is that as we look at the history of democratic or republican governance styles, we can go all the way back to say something like the ancient Roman Republic, the res publica, which etymologically is the root of our word republic. And we can see a sort of growing circle of whom the government was democratically responsible to. You know, Roman citizenship was a fairly limited affair. Then we've got the American experiment starting out with white property owning males. And so the circle of accountability has been expanding. And to tie this in with the relational relevance realization, I think we're at the point where the circle of accountability can no longer include only just humans. You know, I jokingly say that cats are people too, because I'm a cat person, but I mean, I'm also kind of serious about that. And the earth is as well. You know, you hear the, say, Teilhard de Chardin ideas of, you know, the lithosphere, the biosphere, the noosphere. These things can kind of come together in realizing that the sacred is about being in relationality with those other spheres and realizing the way in which we are helped by those lower layers of this emergence. And I like the way you specifically called it the relational relevance field, because in the conversation we had last week with Forrest and Bonita, there was some discussion of the shift from game theoretic dynamics into field theoretic dynamics and the possibility space opened by that. So I think that synthesis and that frame is useful to bring into this conversation explicitly as well. So yeah, I'm curious where this conversation goes from here.
There, now I couldn't unmute myself for a minute there. So I just want to say one more thing, because I want to pick up on what Evan said, and because I want to make it a little bit more critical, because but he pointed towards something. You see, the thing that the thing that sort of the Protestant Reformation had going for it, I can't believe I'm going to say this, it had God going for it. It had a sense of, right, you don't touch that stuff because it's not yours, right? You're supposed to get in right relationship with it, not you figure out how can I optimize how it's going to be in service to me. I'm making a version of Heidegger's critique, right? That you can't have the sacred if everything is a standing reserve that's in service to you, right? And as long as we have that way of thinking, right, then I don't think anything like the commons is actually available to us, because the commons is actually, I'm going to be more radical here, is something that we have to see ourselves in service to, right? That the commons is where persons and at least meaning-bearing entities, because I agree with Evan, right? That our normativity is expanding, right? But it's the place where that sacred act happens, And it doesn't happen under our algorithmic technological control. It happens according to processes, you know, as Gregg said, relational recursive relevance realization. And so my issue, connecting it to Jordan's other point, is, right, the expanding of the technology is making the technocratic, or what Campagna calls the reality of technic, right? That everything is technical, right? And that we are not, one of the ways in which the technology is so illusory, not in the sense that it's not real, but the way it deludes us, is we are actually being shaped by it, but it tells us that we are in control of it, which is the biggest bullshit, one of the biggest bullshitting things that's going on right now. We are, and this is Heidegger's point, right? We are not, and Campagna's point, we are not in control of it. We're in service of it, but it's not proper service, because it's ultimately egocentric delusion that we are somehow in control of it. And that undermines the capacity to get into right relationship to the commons. Sorry, I'm being a little bit more strident, but I want to make this argument more sort of Socratic. I want to really push on it really hard.
So what I was hearing, and that sort of landed very, very powerfully, was that perhaps it is the joint point, or the singular moment, the transformative event, is exactly at that locus of service, to be of service, to be sort of surrendering to and allowing that which is to flow through you, and to be acting as carefully to be in alignment with that. And what I was imagining, or not imagining, but kind of feeling, going back and forth between what in fact appear to be two completely distinct modes of being in world, is sort of the distinction between, I'll sort of call it like sort of shitty little scared egoic mind and its sort of chattering selfishness, and some other thing. And then I had this visual image of the saints, the ones who had the courage to be, horribly tortured, right? And yet did not recant, and yet did not give up on that thing to which they had pledged wholly to be in service of. Right? The shitty little egoic mind does not have that capacity. It is not that level of courage is a distinctly different kind of color. And you can imagine now, in this moment, with all these people, that if we were to be able to recover that, and to recover that degree of courage, that degree of capacity to be in service to something that is in fact sacred, that this is also the joint point, the center, the shift that allows the possibility of the emergence. Right? That Rome was a violent, powerful state that controlled everything with ruthlessness and blood. And yet it was ultimately completely vulnerable to this shift when people began to make and come from that place, and to recover the reality, not just the notion, but the reality of truly being in service to the sacred.
Yeah, I think there was a reinventio. You mentioned the word that Chris and I are using. And inventio in Latin means both to discover and to make. And so I'm now using this term to try and say something that we're both trying to recover and discover and to make. Yeah, Christianity does a reinventio of the sacred. And I think that's part of what we're trying to figure out here. Because I suspect, and I'm trying to voice this suspicion, that we can't reinventio the notion of power without a corresponding reinventio of the notion of the sacred. Because ultimately what we're pointing to the sacred is we're pointing to a kind of power that we oh, I don't know why my language is getting so biblical today, but that we should not blaspheme against. That the greatest sin, right, was idolatry and blasphemy. And so, not to get this overly religious, but what does it mean? Like, how do we reconceive of the sacred so that people would feel that their lives were well lived according to the standards that Gregg talks about if they were in service to it? Because all of the model I propose right now, that many of the models, and I wish Paul was here, and I mean no disrespect to the existing religions, many of those models don't work. People are not willing to put themselves into service. And so what they do, and this is where I sound like Calvin, they do put themselves into service to something, because people need to be connected to something that they think, because I think Wittgenstein is right. We have to belong to a form of life that transcends us, or normativity makes no, if you are just choosing your norms in a totally solipsistic manner, you have no norms. You can't have a norm. That norms don't work that way, right? Norms have to be, like, and this is Jordan's point, they have to be held in common, right? And so the question that keeps coming up, and I think I'm getting more clear on explicating it, is what does the sacred have to be such that we are in service to it, such that that constrains how we conceive of governance? Now I'm getting clearer to the question I want to ask.
As you mentioned, this blaspheming as a topic, I think it's relevant to bring in both the concept from Taoism that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, as well as in the earlier Abrahamic religion, say Judaism, looking at how you're not actually supposed to pronounce the word Yod He Vav He except in very specific sacred circumstances, and that word itself is a form of the verb to be, right? Essentially. So there is this common thread through a lot of these ancient wisdom traditions that in our attempts to linguistically pin down the sacred, we end up walling off ourselves from it in some sort of paradoxical process. And so we can use words as indexical gestures to point at this thing that is the sacred. But I personally feel a bit of caution at trying to pin down what is the sacred in a language game and say, there, now we've got it, right? There's an open-ended relational discovery process or reinventio process that is relevant to the individual and collective relationship with the sacred here. I'm also partial to Plato's term anamnesis as far as how this works. So I just wanted to bring that into this discussion explicitly.
No, I thank you for that, Evan. And yeah, I think anamnesis is well, it's something I'm thinking about a lot right now, because like I just read the Mina with somebody, and that weird normativity, right? That we both discover, but think it was always there to begin with, and that's the same normativity I find going on in Dialogos, right? People, wow, what is this? But oh, this was always here. That weird anamnesis, and I don't want to. I'm not trying to ask. I want to be clear, because you're drawing me out very well. I don't want to propose a definition, not at all. I don't want to use James Carson's language. I'm not trying to make this into a finite game. What I want to know is here's some older models that I don't think work. Just by contrast, the sacred is what is perfect. That's I think that doesn't work anymore, because I don't think that, because perfection has a sense of completeness and finishedness to it, a finality to it, that doesn't work for us anymore. I mean, in fact, the word that's usually translated as perfect in Greek, it means actually completed, right? And this, I'm a great lover of Plato, but Plato's notion that the good is completely static is very problematic, right? So that's what I mean. I don't mean a definition. I mean, how do we break it free so that people, in the way they are living their lives now, feel that it is vitally possible, and they have a vital responsibility to getting into right relationship of service to this. I'm not trying to get a definition as like, do we think of it as, the inexhaustible? What are we doing here? Because we have a lot of implicit models that are sewn into the way we think and live and move and have our being. And if we don't challenge them, with something that's more attractive, then I think this project isn't going to really get off the ground. I'm being very sort of bold right now, but that's my concern.
Yeah, I feel there's one arc, one branch that might be useful, but also feels like a bit of a distraction. So I'll just sort of put it out there and tag it. Is the sort of the conversation about the various different ways that things go wrong. You mentioned, for example, the colonization of the church into state or stateness in the embodiment of the Middle Ages. But I feel like right now the attention is on this notion of the sacred, and what I would bring into it is, and to maybe to simplify, or not to simplify, but to return to the simple, is the language of the commons, and then the language of commoning, and the reminder, the remembering that the verb is more fundamental than the noun, and so that the sacred is the same notion, the same kind of error as the enstating of the church. And it is the colonization of the verb by the nominative, and is sort of a simple error, right? An error of the grammar that we find ourselves falling into. But it is in fact a quality of relationality, right, in its essence. So imagine that you found yourself in a circumstance where you're in relationship with some aspect of the real. Let's go with the child. They're usually pretty good examples of this sort of thing. Your own child. It doesn't have to be. And let's say you happen to be the kind of person who is actually capable of doing something like loving another being. Everyone is actually, but you're sort of, you can sort of embody that. And so you love your child, and you witness your child in life, and you witness the intrinsic necessity of your child having a singular life that is theirs and theirs alone, truly owned. And then you feel into what is in fact your capacity. What is your right relationship with that unfolding? That's the sacred, right? That is sacreding. And then, for to Evan, it includes a lot more than cats, right? In its essence, this mode of being in relationship, this capacity to be seeking the right relationship of self with other, right, is in fact seeking continuity of contact with the whole. And then if you can feel what it feels like to be able to achieve a fluidity of continuity of contact with the whole, and this being both the generator and the cause of seeking to be of service to the singular unfolding of all that which one comes into relationship with. That is another way of describing the sacred that now includes nouns and verbs, and also adverbs, which are more fundamental still, as John has taught me.
So something that I'm hearing in your words here is pointing me towards the importance in human experience of initiatory experience, and how that is underemphasized in the current cultural landscape. And so what I mean by this is that a common pattern you see in cultures which emphasize the relationship with the sacred is the means by which those already in some sort of right relationship with the sacred, or commoning, or the verbal dynamic aspect of the sacred, can reach out a hand and through a process give people leg up into that. And we have echoes of this in some of the ancient wisdom traditions, but we have seemed to, as a culture, have lost a lot of that. And so like when we look at say Plato talking about the good as perfectly static, he's sort of riffing on Parmenides there, right? And Parmenides himself was a iatromantus, was a, Peter Kingsley has some excellent work on this topic, was a member of an initiatic lineage that did a practice of incubation where they had mystical experience and brought each other forward into the sacred as a continual part of their practice. You have meditative traditions throughout the Christian, the Eastern, the indigenous worlds. And this was emphasized as an essential part of what it meant to grow up as a human. And this is severely underemphasized in our current cultural salience landscape for the most part, though this is beginning to change. And I think this is part of the key to the recommoning of and resacralization of the commons.
Yeah, a lot to digest there. I saw a comment by David just run by, and it resonated with me. And that is that after I had a conversation with Jordan, I was talking about commons and commoning, and it was building off conversations that Jordan, John, and I were having about key and wisdom energy. And I had the experience basically of flowing work effort out of the ego and into the space of shared valued states of being. And that echo of being seemed to capture, it felt very, well, sacred, to put a word on it, in relation, in the sense that and I was reminded of Confucian notions of the expanding, evolving, and inclusive ego of being. And of course, the general sense of unity and value while appreciating diversity. And that felt at least like I got a slice of right relations with commoning.
I think that's very central, stitching together as best I can what Jordan and Evan and Gregg said. Because I'm still trying, like, I think I have research and evidence and argument that human beings love it when they get into these relationships. We seem, I mean, wonder and awe are and flow are some of the experiences that people rate as the most significant of their lives, and the ones that give them meaning in life, which is not the same thing as subjective well-being. People will sacrifice subjective well-being for meaning in life. But I guess if we love it so much, why is it so hard for us? Right? That's what I keep banging my head against these days, is right. And I'm trying to understand. Maybe this is linking up with Jordan's tangent, right? Just what's holding us back, right? That's what's really pressing on me right now.
Well, one thing that I'd like to put out there,
please,
honestly, and maybe even a way of sort of allowing a sense of forgiveness, self-forgiveness, in the context of the notion of initiation. I think it's important to recognize that our current culture is perhaps, I can't say it's the most profane thing that has ever existed, because I don't know exactly how profane the last moments of cultures that have collapsed were like. But the key insight is that from the moment that you are born, scarcely an instant of lived sacredness is allowed. It is rendered either antiseptic in the techno bureaucratic, or it is extracted, chewed up, and shat back out at you in a simulacrum. Given no harmonious felt sense, no capacity, no finger hold on the sacred in any direction, it's hard, one, to be able to discover in oneself the capacity to begin to remember that. We are a long, long way. And so one part of the answer to the problem is that when you live in a kingdom of the profane, it is no wonder that it is difficult to recover the sacred, which doesn't help us a whole lot, other than just to let us acknowledge that, okay, I guess that's where we are. Pardon me. We do then have that branch. Where do things go wrong? How in the world do we find ourselves here? And how might we avoid having that happen? And then we also have the deeper first step, which is, okay, how do we begin to consistently, effectively, and with more and more people and more deeply remember this commons, the sacred, in ourselves from where we are, because this is where we are. Those are two distinct things that are very important. And it's interesting to sort of notice that it does appear to be that the sine qua non is in fact interior. And the sine qua non is to find within yourself that continuity of contact with the whole that allows you to, at the very least, orient towards the world, the outside, in some sensibility of the relation of the sacred. And then the more and more as you share that with other people, to mirror that, to become a mirror that allows others to feel that in themselves and notice, oh, this is what that place feels like, and then to learn to dance it into the world together.
That really is good, because that makes me think of a term again from the Christian heritage and from Luther, because part of it, what it sounded like is, yeah, there's a self-knowledge that affords us the ability to discern as a way of being fellowship, which is different from citizenship, which is different from being a member of a market. And notice I don't fellowship and people in what are, the spiritual ecological movement talk about a sense of fellowship with the environment. I don't want to lose Evan's point, because I think it's a very important one. And so to me, and also that's kind of what we do when we go through the initiation rites. We gather together in fellowship at weddings and in baptisms, at funerals, right? And so it sounded to me like what you're saying is, maybe I'm forcing things, but it sounded to me like you're saying we need to recover the capacity for generating, recognizing, and I'm going to put those two together, generating and recognizing, discerning fellowship. What is it to be? Because it's not the same thing as friendship. It's not the same thing as citizenship, right? Because we right? So what, because isn't that how we gather in the commons? Isn't that how we gather around the sacred? We come in, it's not friendship, it's not citizenship, it's not market ownership or consumption. It's this other mode, this interbeing mode. And I acknowledge, Jordan, you're right. You have to sort of fundamentally be fellowship with yourself before you can enter into it with other people. I'm acknowledging that, but I'm trying to group the two together. And so it seems to me that, in fact, what's happening now then, right, the moment of theoria, the moment of dialogos, is we're doing it. We're trying to feel our way towards, and that's what Peter's Stoa is around. That's what the Stoa was, right? That's what right? We're trying to feel our way and figure our way and fumble our way. There's 3 F's, that's good, right? Into fellowship. What is it like? What's it like? What's it, right? That's to me now what I'm hearing from what you're saying.
Amen. I think that's a wonderful pickup. And I'll say, I'll make a recommendation. I was listening to Rick Roderick's 8-part lecture series, Self Under Siege. A wonderful articulation of what the 20th century, or the last 150 years, has done to ourself and has done to our sense of fellowship, although he doesn't use that word. But the fragmentation, the atomization, and the instrumentation and the consumerism of everything, right, dissolves so much of what could be the connection toward sacred with our fellows.
And to your point here, and to the earlier question that was put out of what's blocking us from this as a relevant topic, I think it's worth bringing in the notion of what Kevin Kelly calls the technium in his book, What Does Technology Want? It's sometimes useful to think about the technological sphere, the technosphere, as something which has emerged over roughly the same time period you were just pointing to, Greg. And to look at it as, from a certain frame, perhaps wanting things. And what it might want might be us being in a more atomized, looking outward state rather than going inward, because it makes our attention more monetizable. It makes our labor more monetizable, et cetera, et cetera. And so this might be of value to the technosphere, the technium itself, in terms of what technology kind of inherently teleologically wants. And not that technology is at all a bad thing. I'm mainly a technologist, professionally speaking, but that being said, it does have certain tendencies towards certain polarities with respect to the types of action and ways of being it draws humans into. And noticing that that is the case and choosing instead, as we're perhaps doing here, to go inward and go inward and through the inward into the field of the intersubjective through acts like Dialogos is a potent remedy to what technology seems to want, I think.
So I just want to gather some thoughts together. So I'm hearing, it sounds like these things are converging, and I want to see if it's converging for you guys. That fellowship is about being in co-service together. And that then the important question is what, and then service, to not be idolatrous, has to be to the sacred. And that's, you know, the Tillich claim, right? Otherwise it's idolatry, and then we fall into all of the great human errors. That's why the first sin is the sin of idolatry, right? I mean, in the commandments, right? So we are having demands placed on us by technology, if I understand what Evan's saying, that are perhaps blinding and deafening our ability to hear the way the real is calling to us. I'm thinking now of Yaden's work and the sense of being called as the primary thing that draws people into service. It's not that they have a job or a career. There's a sense of being called by something, and that calling is being deafened again by the bullshitting of technology, putting demands on us without giving us something that's not, without giving us a right relationship to the sacred, but in fact, blocking it for us in some way. And that, therefore, again, I don't want to come off as a techno peasant or something like that. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I'm trying to understand here, right? I'm trying to sense if there's a logos emerging here. That, you know, the notions of service and fellowship and right relationship, and then being called by the sacred, right? Called into service together. We all hear something together that calls us into service together. And that how that's different from everything. We think everything's in service to us, but we're actually in a diluted fashion serving what technology wants. Did that feel fair? Because I'm trying to gather things together so that they can have a momentum. They can start to self-organize. They can start to flow.
If perchance someone has a challenge with the anthropomorphic language of what technology wants, we can relanguage it with finding ourselves caught in the slipstream of the state of change in the field of choice that we find ourselves in as a consequence of the discovery of innovation or the expansion of the adjacent possible. I can go sort of as arbitrarily deep into nerd space as you'd like on this particular question. And what I can tell you is that it's grounded. So the languaging of it as what technology wants is not woo. It's just a useful, simple way of describing what is in fact a very fundamental dynamic in world in relationship to change, innovation, and game theoretic strategy.
Yeah, I might describe it as technology as a memeplex tends to systematically shift the salience landscape of individuals towards instrumental notions of salience, relating to the salience of objects and people and entities and other meaning-bearing systems. I love that phrase, by the way. Relating to those in a sense of how are you instrumentally useful to me or to the technological system, both, right? And those are fundamentally ways of relating to other meaning-bearing systems and the earth itself and the biosphere that generates our ability to even exist. That I'm just going to be straight up and say that takes us away from the sacred. It takes us away from what Schleiermacher called the intuition of the infinite as the root of all religion in the positive sense, which is something that I think we need to recover as a society. And technology has a hard time dealing with infinities, right? They're non-computable in certain important senses, but religion, the sacred, in fact, has at its root an intuition of the infinite. I agree with Schleiermacher on this point.
Yeah, we can put that in just if we're struggling with it. In terms of, I believe that the relationship between instrumentality and valued states of being itself is absolutely crucial and can be felt very clearly. Just imagine yourself saying, oh yeah, I'll pay my wife $20 to be a good wife, or she'll pay me, or I'll be paid to be a good father, right? As soon as you start thinking about I'd be paid to father my children in the right way, the corruption of that becomes instantaneous, at least for me. And it's just like, oh God, what is that, oh God, felt sense? It is, I value my children at their essential level, not to manipulate them or to instrumentally manifest some social control or outcome that then gets rewarded some other way. It is value in and of itself. It's part of the ultimate, not end, as opposed to any particular means. So in the relational space, for me, it's easy then to see the contrast and then to generalize that about what feels valued in the ultimate sense. And of course, Aristotle talks deeply about the ultimate end and eudaimonia. And of course, this has become part of, well, what is flourishing in sort of the positive psychology literature, not to go there.
And to tie this, what you just said, a bit into the dialogos that happened in this space last week, and even into some of the terminology common around discussing some of this stuff with like the game A, game B terminology, that incentivization where somebody's now paying you to do something and you've put some finite numbers on the transaction and so on, that just leads pretty inevitably to emergent game theoretic dynamics rather than the sort of field theoretic dynamics of interacting attractor/generators, which is more what human beings and their heart-based, soul-based relationships actually, I think, are.
So if I understand what everybody's saying here is that, I mean, I don't want to just say stuff that's been said before, but there is then, we're dealing, it sounds like a fundamental sort of modal confusion, right? We're dealing with, right, a way of thinking that is appropriate to the control and manipulation and the consumption of things. And that's how things are relevant to me. And that's, right, a primary relation. And then there's the mode in which we want to have, right, the being mode, which I think I want to change that. I think that's too a little too Parmenian. I think it should be called the becoming mode now. It's a developmental mode. And then that says to me then, and Aristotle was invoked by Gregg, that if we're talking about fellowship and service, then we need to talk about a virtue, which is the virtue that gets us into the proper relationship with that which calls us beyond ourselves into service together. And that's the virtue of reverence. And see, that then leads me to think that one of the things that's blocking us right now is a pervasive popular culture in which irreverence and outrage are considered virtuous behavior, and finding things reverent is somehow like who was I talking to? I think it was Damien. You know, that people will, they have no problem that Superman can fly and make heat vision come out and he can lift buildings, but that he acts according to a moral code like a Boy Scout. Oh, come on. Like, doesn't that tell you how twisted we've become? That we'll believe all this other shit, but the possibility that somebody might have a reverential attitude, this guy is mighty beyond us, and he still sees himself in service to something beyond himself. And that's just, that part's ridiculous. Give me Batman any day, because he's so irreverent. And so I think there, I mean, I'm beginning to hear the beginnings of a significant cultural critique is like, we need to challenge, we need to stand up and say, no, reverence is the good thing. Irreverence should only be used in virtuous satire when people are being pompous or arrogant. It shouldn't be considered the general, virtue, especially when it's linked to outrage and things like that. And so for me, what I'm hearing coming out of this as a consequence is, that if people want to enter into fellowship together, they need to revalorize the virtue and commit to helping each other cultivate the virtue of reverence, which is the virtue of the proper relationship to what fills us with awe.
That feels right to me in terms of, especially in terms of an imminent critique of modern culture and some of the things that have been grossly underdeveloped or transformed in their evolution away from, well, I mean, Nietzsche obviously with God is dead. I mean, what is going to happen when we overpower our capacity for knowledge of the material world and technocratic control and regulation, and then power for hedonic fun seeking, with anyone that believes more than that is naive. We all know that matter is what's real. I mean, those are going to echo across a multitude of different layers, and ultimately, I think, have corrupted the soul of our civilization.
And I agree with your summarization or direction that what is needed is the recovery of reverence, essentially gesturing at those things which make us feel awe, as that cluster feels really right. I would also add that to the cultural critique, the sort of dialectic that's been going on of the polarization of the divine over the past several thousand years. You could go into the topics of, say, the alphabet versus the goddess here, where in the Abrahamic traditions, the divine was identified as primarily masculine. The feminine aspects of the divine were, depending on which sub-tradition of the Abrahamic you want to look at, either de-emphasized or almost completely erased. And this is a incomplete and not right relationship with that of which we should be reverent. I mean, we want to talk about the generation function that gives rise to all life. You can't leave out the feminine archetypes from that, right? And so that is partially, I think, a earlier stage in what has eventually evolved into what we might call the technium. And it's this is a necessary dialectic. We got a lot out of that, but it is time to move forward in this dialectic process and move to a new synthesis. And so with that, I've been called to tag Peter back into this conversation. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
All right. So we have about 20 minutes left, and we'll go to field some Q&A. And sorry about we got Zoom bombed earlier. Someone posted the direct link to Twitter, so we had some people come in. That's why the mute options were funny for a bit. So I'm going to give everyone permission to unmute themselves. So hopefully we see no naked dudes starting dancing in our Zoom screens. And let's take in David first for a question. David Swedlow.
All right. Yeah, the question really kind of arises from the combination of these sessions plus the conversations that you, Gregg and Jordan and John had. The wisdom energy chi stuff arising. Something I'm going to phrase. Don't have the question right in front of me, but basically the question is something like, it feels like to me that the chi is always running. It's normally running on autopilot. In moments of flow, it can kind of come into the awareness of, oh, I'm actually riding this thing. This chi is in me arising in this moment, coming in, and that's an experience of something sacred. That is where reverence starts to come into the moment of allowing that to come forward. And the curiosity is like something like this: does the wisdom energy, does this give rise to letting go of the incrustations, my attachments, to allow myself to come into the present moment, letting go of my attachment to past memories, to future, to anticipations, to really arise in the moment, let go of all of the burdens that I would carry to arise in this moment. And my sense is that's what we're looking at cultivating and the ecology of practices and relevance realization. So I'm curious if that resonates with what y'all are discussing.
Yeah, David, and it's good to see you, by the way. Always good. Yeah, that's why, I mean, I please, I'm not reducing all of what we're talking about to the phenomena I'm going to point to. I'm only pointing to it as an exemplary case. Okay, is that clear, everybody? But that's why that's why I'm so interested in this continuum between insight and flow. Because especially in the flow experience is this wonderful experience that tells you can actually deepen your agency, perhaps even Jordan's idea of sovereignty, as you step out of an egocentric state of mind. That's what the flow experience actually tells us. And there's no argument needed, right? It's a universal phenomena. That's one of its more important features. It's evolutionary primary. I think there's reasons for that. I won't go into the scientific justification. And again, I'm not saying that flow is reverence. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, though, is I'm saying that flow gives us the phenomenological, directly interior, exterior evidence, like the self-evident evidence, analogous to the writers of the Declaration, right? That you don't lose agency when you lose the egocentric way of being. You actually enhance agency as you find yourself connected and at one with something beyond yourself. So I think there is very good reason to think that wisdom energy, chi, will be a proper part of getting us to do the metanoia, the turning that is needed for the proper cultivation of reverence. And one of the defining features of reverence isn't envious. Like we talk about the American dream. Well, Canadians do. I don't know if Americans still do, because I think they're losing faith in it. But because Canadians never understood the American dream, because we weren't built that way. But the thing is, right, the American dream used to be, right, that people sort of revered a kind of freedom. I think that's what it was. And freedom is an important thing. But now it's right. Reverence should give you the discernment to distinguish between the aspiration to self-transcendence by connecting to something beyond yourself and the envy to be of higher status or power. And so I'm thinking of the work of Girard here. So that's why I'm calling reverence a virtue. You see, that the problem is awe can be steered either way. The Nazis were excellent evidence of that, as were the communists, right? But the virtue of reverence helps us discern the difference between idolatry and sacreding, to pick up Jordan's, like not the lust for power and wealth and fame, but something other than that. The sense of being called beyond oneself and called with others in service to something, precisely because that is the best way for all of us to be. That's how I want to answer that, David.
Yeah, I'll riff off of that from my perspective, because I sort of landed on this concept of wisdom energy through my own path. And what I'm feeling now is sort of a completed Moebius loop of a journey that starts in the psychotherapy room with the felt sense of real suffering before you. How do you join with that as a therapist? How do you empathize with that as a person in your own neurotic, difficulties? How do you then gain knowledge and clarity, psychological knowledge, broad philosophical knowledge, and then return to metabolize that back into the world with meta reflection grounded in values and oriented toward valued states of being? And then, so I sort of made this flip in my head and went a little hypomanic doing it because my cells metabolized it as it was happening, was a return from knowledge into, sort of the being of sort of the felt embodiment of wisdom, whereby the justification of knowledge fades, just like in a flow experience. And then there's a full, coherent, integrated enactment. At least that's the felt experience of it. And then it was sort of like, if that echo could happen, right? And if we echoed off of each other as that happened, well, that would be a much better state, perhaps, than the current trajectory.
I want to pick up on what John and Greg just said and also tie in something from your initial question, David. You mentioned that when one starts investigating the phenomenon of chi phenomenologically, one notices that it's been there and it's kind of been on autopilot. And if you investigate phenomenologically this autopilot-based flow, you'll notice that it doesn't actually stop at what you thought the boundaries of yourself were in terms of the body. And so this is something that's deeply related to what Greg was just speaking on in terms of metabolizing that back into the world. And what if we were all doing this? Again, we get into field theoretic dynamics here where we can become conscious participants in the interplay of wisdom energy as generating complexity and life and all of this wonderful stuff that we value. And that experience in itself, that phenomenological investigation where we go deep in ourselves, notice that we're already so deeply interconnected in terms of chi or wisdom energy with the surrounding fields, itself is an experience that will almost certainly produce the kind of awe that John speaks of that leads to reverence.
Maybe Dialogos is the practice of fellowship for the participation in awe and the cultivation of the virtue of the reverence to it.
Susan, you had a question.
Yes. Can you hear me? Say yes. So thank you guys, Greg and Peter and Jordan and John. So how does affordances impact agency or vice versa? I mean, I'm trying to kind of put this into a pragmatic form of the implicit and explicit social contracts in commoning.
Can I steal that and combine it with what I was some of the piece? I think these go together quite beautifully. What flashed into my mind as you invoked the notion of affordances, and then came into relationship with the notion of flow, was development or learning. Something like there is a thing that wishes to flow through you into the world. There is a you and there is a world, which is to say there's a moment, a point of contact. There is an affordance for the capacity of that flow to realize itself, to embody itself into the world. To the degree to which you listen to that flow and allow yourself to become a vehicle and a vessel for the embodiment of that which seeks to flow through you, this will naturally have the characteristic of development, i.e. your capacity and the nature of the world will change so as to increase the point of contact. The affordance will grow to enable a higher degree of flowing of this into the world until it has in fact fully realized itself, if such a thing is a possible thing to say.
That was great, Jordan. I mean, this language has become, I feel a responsibility to answer Susan's question because this is the language of my business, which is cognitive science and 4E cognitive science. And so I don't want to take away from what Jordan said, because Jordan was emphasizing the performative aspect of this, which is, I think, crucial. I'm now going to talk maybe towards the ontological aspect of it, which is the idea that the way 4E cog sci understands the relationship is that they are co-defining. So that you give up the idea of a Lockean agent inside your cabinet consciousness that then computes things from the world and acts on the world. And then what you get is an affordance is actually something between the environment and an organism that allows the organism to become an agent. So an affordance is a way in which an organism and an environment mutually shape, and this is an ongoing verb, they're mutually shaping each other so that the organism is capable of reliably altering its behavior in order to achieve its goals, and that would make it an agent. So that's sort of the ontological answer. How I think that fits into the performative answer, which I think is more important, that Jordan gave, is that when we shift from thinking of agency as something that's like in us or possessed by us, that's what I want to challenge, rather to seeing it as something that we participate in with the environment, that our agency is co-created with the environment, by the environment and us as an organism together. So that makes possible the loop that Jordan talked about. Because if my agency arises, co-emerges with features or patterns in the environment, then that agency can then disclose other new affordances, which then can transform the agency, and so on and so forth. So that loop that Jordan was emphasizing is grounded in an idea of an inherently dynamical system relationship of agency. I don't know if that helped, but sometimes grounding the performative in an ontological framework helps people.
I'll add a slice to that. I often talk about affordances and stressors together in the therapy room. So you have a calling to approach, you see an opportunity to invest in, but also there's all this entanglement with potential injury and damage. So you see out the possibility of positive investments that the environment affords you in a feedback, but you also see the danger. My friend Mike Mascolo talks about, well, we have a love of other, we want to connect, but we have a fear for the self. And that loop is so much of what I see in the therapy world, is a fear for the self and the past traumas and injuries around the self and the confusions of the head relative to the heart, relative to the important others, that then result in this reciprocal narrowing of fear and defense, and an entrapment that fails to see potential affordances and generally see stressors. And what that basically says is this is a constant agent arena entanglement and a constant dynamic relation. And to the extent that we can open up the matrix of proper relation of affordances and stressors, I think that's all part of what this process can be thought of as being about.
I just wanted to say what Gregg just did was brilliant. He made a tight connection between affordance and addiction. I thought that was really, really good. That was really well done, Gregg.
Something suggested also by what Gregg just said has to do with the notion of hormesis. And this also ties in with the previous discussion of wisdom energy, because I think the more in touch with this wisdom energy aspect of our phenomenological experience that we can be, the more stressors can contribute to hormesis and therefore be eustress rather than distress. It increases our affordances in that area as well.
And I'll just make a comment about that, appreciating stress. See, one of the one of the great tragedies of our current environment, I believe, is a complete failure to think about and appreciate negative emotion, indeed the wisdom of negative emotion. Too often negative emotions are negative. Okay. We do not know how to appropriately metabolize and relate to them, what they do for us rather than what they do to us. We teach kids to experience, oh God, I hate this anxiety. Well, ultimately that then the anxiety not only is the negative feelings, but the stress reaction to that, which creates then what I call the neurotic loop, which then does result in reciprocal narrowing desires to escape and a fundamental resistance, which the Buddha realized a long time ago is at the root of so much suffering.
A previous guest, Shinzen Young on the Stoa, has a wonderful little pithy equation that suffering equals pain times resistance. And so by engaging with this wisdom energy, we in essence lower the resistance, lower the suffering, and appreciate the pain for the frankly teacher that it sometimes can be.
So we have about 5 minutes to the bottom of the hour. I'm going to tag in Jordan for maybe closing thoughts. Maybe we can have closing thoughts from all the speakers today, and then we can close out officially.
Sure. The thing that was coming up for me the most in these last few minutes was a beginning of a nod towards the directionality of how. And here, when I think how, I don't mean merely the how of things like, how do we come into fellowship? How do we attune to the sacred? How do we rediscover reverence? All of which are fundamental, but also the bigger how. How do we navigate through this transition? How do we replace the colonization of the commons? How do we establish a new form of market and state? How do we govern ourselves? How do we simultaneously become capable of governing ourselves in the context of the complexity that we have made for ourselves, and in relationship with the complicatedness that we have shackled ourselves to? That big how. And a deep sense, almost in the sort of yep, that this is the beginning. From this place, from fellowship, and only my proposition is from fellowship, which includes these characteristics of right relationship with the sacred, of reverence, of attunement, of listening, of flow, of development, of conformity. Do we have a place that is strong enough to then do the next thing? And when we do have that, we do have a place that is strong enough to do the next thing. So it is the first how.
I was echoing that with a comment that John made in terms of the losing of the American dream. Okay. Having the feeling of the culture at large, I think when we talk about the how, obviously the transformation that we're potentially envisioning, a new axial age, is so dramatic that, it's almost insufferably grandiose to really be talking about it in any specifics. And yet at the same time, I do encourage us to think very seriously about the fellowship that's brought in a conversation like this in direct contrast to so much of what we see. And if we embody that contrast in a particular way, it certainly is the drop of an echo of what the how might look like if it gets distributed. And at least we can see the contrast of the valued states of being in the microcosms of these kinds of exchanges, in the fellowship that they bring forth, and the ideas and the collective intelligence, and have the felt sense of difference in so many other contexts.
I want to echo what Gregg said and fully endorse that, and also echo a similar moment that happened in the Dialogos last week, where we expressed how, in a certain sense, what was going on right then was an act of recommoning. And in that case was a giving of the gift of, in the moment, vulnerable, not always correct, dynamic sense making, showing that process with all of its, all of its beauty and all of its flaws, and putting that into a space of the commons. And, everyone here that we've been speaking with today, Peter, Jordan, Greg, John, I personally have been a hermit for 10 years. And the fact that you all have been talking about this publicly and engaging in Dialogos is what drew me out of that into engagement in this way. And the gifts you're giving into the commons are doing some work. There's some real magic happening there. And I really do think that stuff like this is exactly where we start and how we move forward, bringing more people into the conversation, etc. So thank you all again.
Thank you. And Evan just said a word that came up for me, especially from Jordan's question, but also in Gregg's riffing on it, about the primary how. It reminds me in the symposium where Plato talks about how we can go from physical beauty to the beauty of institutions and then the beauty of virtue, and that, right? And what we're actually talking about is a kind of aesthetic, and that word has now been so trivialized that it's not the right word anymore, but I don't know what word to use, because I think we're talking about how do we train our salience landscaping to pick up on the affordances that call us into this new way of life. And what was coming to my mind also was what, in reference to what Jordan said, is right, Han's critique of beauty, and that we've reduced beauty to the smooth. And Gregg was picking up on this. Like, it's ugly if it has negative or challenge in it. He talks about we've reduced, everything is the aesthetics of the smooth. We want everything to run smoothly. And we want things to be smooth, because what we've done is we've reduced the capacity for beauty to strike us. People used to be struck by beauty. And I think part of what gets us into awe is a willingness to be struck by things. And and I think Gregg is pointing to something that, think about how this word has changed, but negative emotions are very often awful in both senses of the word, right? We don't like them. Yesterday I was in the grip of a very powerful negative emotion, but they have the capacity to take us out of this lust for the smooth and remind us how jagged reality is and how complex it is. And so my final thoughts in answer to Jordan is, part of the how of how we make the place, because this is what they had to do with the Stoa, is how do we get people to find that place beautiful in the right way? So that's my attempt to at least help start the first how. And I want to thank everybody, all my interlocutors, my fellows, Jordan and Evan and Gregg, and of course, Peter, for inviting me, and for all of the wonderful people here in this community. So thank you very, very much. It means a lot to me to be able to participate in things like this.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. It's a beautiful way to end this Dialogos session. So we'll be here next week for the last one in Jordan's series. We have quite a lineup. Nora Bateson, Chris Masterpietro, Richard Bartlett, and Greg Thompson are scheduled to be here with Jordan in conversation. And then the new year, this might be, I was flirting with having a Dialogos Fun Day Mondays at this time. We just have this interesting combination, continuing this conversation, this thread. So you can check that out on the website. Forrest Landry is coming in at 5 p.m. for his Sensemaker in Residence series. And then later tonight, we got Tyson Yunkaporta doing a session called Slow Down, Calm Down, Scale Down, and Step Down, which is a riff on Ken Wilber's growing up, waking up, cleaning up thing, which is pretty cool. Oh yeah, and there's something else I want to share with everyone, because tomorrow we're having a symposium at the Stoa. It's the Unsuccess Symposium. Let us get successful so we can stop giving shit about getting successful. And we have a bunch of cool people. David Allen from Getting Things Done is going to start, kick us off. But we have people with new thought, productivity, procrastination experts, all that type of stuff. And like we've been saying here, losing at game A does not make you win at game B. So come check out that. It's going to be a whole day event. So that being said, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.